Maplestory the Novel, Season 1, Sacred Tears. Chapter 5, Part 1. Pain. Unending haze made the months drag by. The blast had taken everything away from Dane. Menodora, Maxis, and Adelia had all vanished from his life, leaving a consuming emptiness behind. John and Sari, Menodora's parents, were far enough away from the Great Circle to survive the blast and did what they could for Dane. All of them comforted each other when the pain of their losses became too much. Arcarium's expertise was requested to contain and then dissipate the mass amount of anti-magic blanketing the city. Once the task was complete, the alchemists of Margata began rebuilding and healing those who were alive and severely injured. Regrettably, chaos descended onto Margata in the form of a passive war between the Acaldos and the Zumaists. Each faction fiercely blamed the other for the catastrophe of the Great Circle. The Zumaists blamed the Acaldos for the careless creation of their machines that, to their eyes, ultimately rejected the organic components of humanoid A. Madae and the Acaldos, in turn, blamed the Zumaists for not creating their biological pieces with enough durability to withstand the inorganic mechanical elements.
It was pure folly to think that machines could live as humans do. Your mechanical creations vaporize the flesh of the body, creating too much energy for the Great Circle to handle.
Carl would shout when he caught sight of Madae.
You would think those who specialize in creating organic material for this very purpose would know how to do such a thing.
Madae shot back, making Carl grind his teeth in rage.
Our research was perfect. If you had properly trained your apprentice, the Great Circle wouldn't have been compromised. You no doubt told him to sabotage the experiment so that you could have exclusive access to Dr. Long and his favor.
I banished him from the Alcados weeks before this happened. Russell was acting on his own. If you hadn't agreed to show him what you had of your beliefs, I wouldn't have had to dismiss him when his experiments became too immoral.
Immoral?
Their arguments would continue to escalate into violence until the factions split the city entirely. Russell was ultimately imprisoned for his actions after having his eye and part of his face grafted with a mechanical replacement. No trace of Dr. Long was ever found, but his humanoid A body did survive, which seemed to contain some of Dr. Long. He still had his brilliant mind for alchemy and science, but it was nowhere near what Dr. Long was, nor did he have any memory of Felicia or Kenny. However, he did seem to care for both of them, staying with them as a helper and tutor. Felicia believed that if there was some part of Matthias that still existed out there, he would come back to her one day. While glad that Dr. Long's experiment had succeeded at least in part, the gnawing emptiness still ate at Dane. His research of darkness became a chore. He would read through his and Menodora's notes, feeling a presence surround him in warmth and comfort. A few times, he thought it might be some fragment of Menodora, or perhaps it might have been his mind wandering to a memory of her during a time of idle thought. Each time, the feeling would come and go like another person, and not just a memory. Maybe there was some small piece of Menodora left, just waiting for him to bring her back. He began to search in earnest for a way to isolate that presence. It was a glimmer, the spark of hope he needed to spur him on. But as time passed, his search brought him to one absolute conclusion. There was no reviving the dead. However, that presence persisted, almost urging him to finish what he had started. His loss of Menodora brought him new insights into darkness. It stemmed from wounds left behind in people's spirits, fresh or aged, by the trials life brought. If tended to soon enough, the person could eventually heal, but it would be different for each person. If these wounds were left unattended, they would fester into poisonous wells of pain overflowing out of control. These wounds often manifest themselves as violence, depression, greed, and depravities of the worst sort in humankind, in an attempt to find a cure. But none would come. Any chance of healing these wounds was remote at the absolute best, non-existent at its worst. Dane felt as if the life had been torn from him when Menodora was taken from him. It just wasn't fair that her bright life was taken from a world that could use it. Had it not been for that presence's constant warmth, he felt that his heart would have easily succumbed to the hate and rage that boiled within him. This presence felt as if it was made of the outward healing light the world needed. Turning his attention to the light he and Menodora had discovered, he tried desperately to harness it once again and combat the darkness. But it seemed there was no conclusive way to simply think of light and erase or push back the darkness. It was far more stubborn than that, and no one person seemed able to generate enough outward light to be used in this manner. The test in Aswan he and Menodora had set up did appear to work, but now that Menodora was gone, the next attempt at spreading the light failed spectacularly. Dane just couldn't bring himself to find the strength and joy to effectively direct the light through the obelisk. A year passed, and then it came. A mighty famine spread through all of Eusoria, and it spread quickly. Those within the area of Margata tried to do as much as possible to slow it down, but it still spread widely. Even the lush and plentiful gardens of New Long in the southwest were decimated by the famine. Word filtered down from Orion that the Emperor was sending aid as far and as fast as possible. Dane shifted his focus from the darkness to the cause of the sudden famine. Entire crops would simply wither overnight. Fruits grown in the East Dragon Forest would rot off their branches. Nothing was safe. He threw himself into the study of magic, the only counter that seemed to stay the famine. Magic may not have been the ultimate answer, but it was a step towards finding one. Additionally, that presence followed him wherever he went as he left his life in Margata behind to help stem the famine's tides. Eventually, Dane accepted that the presence wasn't Menodora, but he couldn't help but imagine that it was some part of her. That sentiment was enough to give him the energy needed to keep moving, helping those he met in the world. As he would travel, misshapen beasts of shadow began to appear, the same he and Menodora had faced years before, only with slightly more form. People and clerics began dubbing him the White Mage for his selfless acts and snow-white hair, but it just wasn't the same. Dane could spend the rest of his life helping those in need, curing illness, bringing food, hope, money, and comfort to those in need. But without Menodora, it drained him. Dane could feel with each passing day the light he had built with her fading from his life. His heart would ache every time he visited a village where both of them had been before, and they would ask where she was. But Dane pushed on, stretching out what little of Menodora's light was left as much as possible. She would want to help those in need, and Dane wanted to preserve that. Nevertheless, how long could he make it last on his own? Ariel followed this man Dane every chance she found an opportunity. She was a goddess, yes, but in her reflective thoughts, she discovered that she had been abhorrently absent in her duties to the people of Eusoria. Minerna had charged her and her two brothers, Haim, deity of life, and Nanahuatzin, deity of light, to watch over the world. But Ariel felt her powers limited her to a lonesome existence. She was granted the ability to protect and control time itself. When she was first given this duty, she used her power to stretch moments for some people into hours, so that one moment could be remembered well, or to help those in dire need. Other times, she would use her power to see what lay ahead and guide them to a better path. Still others, she would look back over a person's life and help them remember important things. But after a few centuries, her ability to define past, present, and future began to blur. Patterns began appearing to her that would explain how certain people would react despite her help. As more time passed, she began to grow disinterested and disconnected. Perhaps she had cared too much? Did she not care enough? It all felt monotonous as fewer and fewer people sought her help or acknowledged her existence. Soon she began shirking her duties to the point of near non-existence. The few prayers of people for their children's protection went unanswered, and time passed her by quietly. She began to wonder what would happen if she were to simply disappear. Her brothers seemed to be doing well and were loved by the people. But she? It almost seemed that she had nearly faded into myth, as only a handful of people still believed and worshipped her with any hint of sincerity. She needed something for herself, something that she could call her own. Looking back on her long life through her mirror of time, Ariel found that something was missing in her soul, and that is why she helped the humans so much. It was a hole that felt as if something had been taken away, but she couldn't define it. Then a massive surge of power jolted her from the pit she had collapsed into. When she extended her mind to the surface, she could hardly recognize the world. Yes, the place she had come to before was originally dimmer than most of the world, but as she followed Dane to see what had become of the world, she could hardly believe her eyes. What had happened? The world she saw was so much colder and unloving than the one she remembered. Had it really been so long since she genuinely cared? She wanted to help, but she was so out of touch with the state of the world, she had no idea how. Her best option would be to follow the man she had seen in the city called Margata. Doing so would allow her to learn much of what humanity had become and how best to help them. As she watched Dane work, she was moved by his compassion. When he would tend to someone with a particularly strong illness, she touched Dane's hand and strengthened his magic. She also amplified his magic when he would build barriers around towns and cities. For all that he did, she found a stirring in her heart, one that she had never felt. Or perhaps it had always been there, but was never fully awakened. Yes, she had felt love towards the people of Eusoria, but this was different. She felt a longing to be with this one human. She knew this human would be gone within a few short decades, but she longed to be with him. Even she began to refer to him as the White Mage. It felt strangely comforting and familiar to be in his presence, despite never having a lover of any kind previously. As the days and weeks passed and she continued to help him, he began to smile sometimes, but there was still a quiet sadness to those smiles. When he was alone, she would come to him, putting her arms around his shoulders and reading the journal he would often look into. It consisted of notes that described darkness, light, and their ultimate forms, fascinating concepts for a human to be looking into. Perhaps she would speak to Nana Huatzin sometime about the subject and gain insight as to why it was so fascinating to Dane. There was also a second book that he would consult from time to time, but this one was different. It didn't look like it belonged. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it was there.